Poll, please.
Present, no known conflict.
Present, no known conflict.
Present, no conflict.
Present, no conflict.
Present, no known conflict.
Okay, I'm present, no conflicts.
Thank you, Jonathan. We appreciate your sitting in for Angela this morning. Thank you very much. First up, we have the minutes from the April 16th CRC meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
I so approve.
Motion been made. Is there a second? All in favor? All opposed? Motion's unanimous. I guess it is, ain't it? Tonka, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you very much. I also would like to welcome Assistant come to our meetings and pay attention to what's going on. And we welcome your presence every time. Thank you.
It's great to be here, and I just have to say we have one good hurricane season. Go Canes! We're still very excited in Raleigh. Yeah, right? But Chair Cahoon, Commissioners, Director Miller, DCM staff, members of the public, it is my pleasure to join you here today in New Bern. Thank you for giving me a few minutes to address the commission today. I think most of you know me. For those of you who don't, I'm Kathy Dello, and I'm the Assistant Secretary for Resilience at DEQ, and I oversee the great work of DCM. First off, I've really enjoyed getting to know all of you and the work of the convention and meeting all of you over the past few gatherings. I've been especially pleased by the collegiality and respect that you show one another and that you show to DCM staff, even when you disagree. North Carolinians in and to our 20 coastal counties benefit from your respectful dialogue and constructive debate. And on behalf of Secretary Wilson, we at DEQ thank you for your commitment to protecting this beautiful coast that we all love. We recognize the hours spent traveling to meetings, reading materials, and long reports like this one, and considering each issue carefully. So I asked for a few minutes today to speak ahead of Dr. Laura Moore's presentation on the report that we're going to hear. And I know we all really want to hear from her, so this is going to be brief. Not only are we fortunate to have the most beautiful coast in the country, we are especially lucky in North Carolina to be home to some of the best coastal scientists in this country. We are grateful that those folks have chosen to serve on the science panel. The group led by Dr. Moore has contributed hours of their own time to this report. And as someone who worked as a scientist at NC State, go Pack, until last August and contributed to reports like this one, I know that their bosses didn't take away any of their other responsibilities when this came up. They still had to teach classes, grade papers, lead field courses, conduct their own research, write grants, the list goes on. So we really, really thank you for your service to the state of North Carolina. And I know of more than one well-deserved vacation following this report release. I do want to take a second to acknowledge that we recognize just how difficult the past year has been for the people of Rodanthe and Buxton. Last November, I joined Secretary Wilson, Governor Stein's team, Director Miller, Dare County Manager Outen, who is here today, and other federal, local, and state officials to tour the threatened homes and witness the significant erosion issues. We heard directly from community members about their concerns, and we are committed to continuing the dialogue about potential solutions with them. At DEQ, every single day we make hundreds of choices about how to manage our environmental resources to protect the health and prosperity of North Carolinians. We look to science to help us make those decisions. And in fact, using best available science to shape publicly supported policies and decisions is part of DCM's vision statement. We also believe that science should be conducted by the experts, such as our science panel, without our influence. This report is truly an independent assessment of what we know about hardened structures and some of the trade-offs, both positive and negative. It will provide a strong scientific baseline and understanding for us all to use as we move forward. And please do consider DEQ leadership to be a committed partner in those conversations. Now I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Moore, so I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for starting this important conversation.
Before we get started, is there anyone here for public comment? Does anybody sign up? Ms. Sawyer. Ryan Harris.
Thank you. I'm reading these comments on behalf of Mr. Chris Squire. Good morning, Commission. My name is Chris Squire, a homeowner in Emerald Isle, and I appreciate the opportunity to present my comments via email regarding the proposed inlet hazard area rule changes. I want to begin by thanking Ken Richardson for meeting with me and representatives from the town of Emerald Isle and for clarifying the change from the hybrid vegetation line to the proposed development line along the face of the existing structures. However, I remain dissatisfied with the proposed rules as I believe they are overly conservative, inconsistent, and inequitable with their effect on property owners. In prior meetings, the phrase "hold the line" was used extensively, seeming to indicate that the proposed rules are intended to prevent development from moving farther seaward. But these proposals do not simply hold the line. In several important ways, may move the line significantly landward and impose new restrictions on existing structures already in place, whose homeowners have no intention of moving closer to the ocean. Under the current framework, the vegetation line serves as a starting point, and the setback then adds a buffer to account for shoreline fluctuation over time. That buffer makes sense because the vegetation line is dynamic. By contrast, switching to the hybrid vegetation line as proposed, or to the slightly modified development line, uses a more landward and conservative reference point. In most locations, that line represents a historical worst case. If the new starting point already captures that conservative conditions, then layering an additional 60-foot or more setback on top of that is unnecessary. Further, the proposal uses the formula of 2 feet times 90 years, or 180 feet, to define the boundary of the inlet hazard area. Again, the proposal takes historic evidence of worst case, then stacks one conservative assumption that erosion of 2 feet will occur where it never has, on top of another, that it would do so every year for 90 years, to produce a boundary that is based on probability will never occur. In Emerald Isle, the CRC has evidence back to 1871, indicating that the shoreline has never reached the location of the current homes. A 180-foot buffer extending beyond anything that has ever occurred is unnecessary. That historical evidence should weigh more than a highly improbable theory. The proposal also adds several new size restrictions. Previously, houses up to 10,000 square feet could be rebuilt or built new. The proposal cuts that in half to 5,000 square feet. Existing homes that are damaged by a disaster could be rebuilt to 5,000 square feet, but voluntary teardowns would be restricted to their current footprint or square footage. And all developments would be expected to move as far landward as feasible, but who defines feasible? These are not only new constraints, but ones that create inequity, penalizing existing homeowners who simply want to maintain or modernize their homes and introducing vague feasibility interpretations. If the intent is truly to hold the line on moving seaward, then these various size restrictions go well beyond that intent. I recognize the Commission's responsibility to manage coastal hazards in a thoughtful, science-based way. I respectfully ask the Commission to pause before advancing these changes in the current form, to remove the existing double counting of the worst case line plus a buffer, and to not add any additional unequal restrictions on building sizes and location. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the council, commission. I think we all know why I'm here. There's not a person in here I haven't spoken with over the last 2 years, but just to put it out there, we're here today at the Buxton Civic Association to urge the commission to support a responsible, modern approach to our coastline by backing the legislative packages advancing in Raleigh. Coastal policies drafted 40 years ago were never meant to be a suicide pact for our coast. Hatteras and Ocracoke are now in state of emergencies, and as North Carolinians, we can all just simply do better. Yesterday during the Senate committee, Senator Mayfield expressed concerns, and I'd like to invite her and all the General Assembly members to come down and tour Buxton, just like you guys did a year ago. I think it would help a bipartisan approach and just get everybody together. It's nothing but beneficial. With all due respect to the senator and the other skeptics, Buxton was not just a failure of nature, but a failure of man. I'm fighting reader glasses right now using them, so I apologize. I really don't like speaking ahead of Lauren and Reed in the presentation too. I wanted to kind of wait till afterwards, but you know, I just thank everybody here for all the attention and everything we've gotten done. Buxton's looking better. You know, things are getting better. It's a shame that we had to lose and deal with what we had to over the last 8 months, but I really do appreciate everything. We just urge this commission to recommend partnerships and look into people like Todd Barber and the Reef Ball Foundation. Look into using commissioned naval ships as structural foundations for offshore reefs and wave breaks. Where defense is impossible, we must pair the engineering with a state-funded buyout program modeled after the Land and Water Conservation Fund. You know, to remove these structures safely before they break into the surf. You know, Buxton's looking pretty good. We got the dune, we got the groin coming, but Redante looks, I mean, we're back to the drawing board over there. You know, I really think this winter going into this fall, they're probably gonna break our record of 20 homes. And that's a horrible contest for us to just have right now. But just once again, I thank everybody in here. Looking forward to the presentation, and I just, we really appreciate everything, so.
Right?
Good morning. I'm here not on behalf of any client. I'm here based on the fact that I've been involved in these issues for 43 years. Don't think many people can beat that. I have mixed feelings. One thing I would like to, for you, okay. Would like to point out is that all coastal development is hardened structure. You know, this issue that's currently being focused on is, you know, erosion control measures that might include groins or the offshore hard structures that could potentially reduce erosion in a particular location. But let's not forget the whole CAMA program is authorizing hard structures in a very dynamic environment, and that's difficult. I'm told through my friendship with Larry Baldwin that Bob Emery made a suggestion about, you know, possibly creating some new AECs that are defined based on particular hotspots in terms of our coastline. Our coastline's extremely varied, but I guess I'm prejudiced by the fact that during all of that time we have had more or less a prohibition on hardened structures, and I would like to remind the members of this commission and the legislature that while far from perfect, something I do a lot of, which is variance requests, there are methodologies for having some flexibility even under what we have now. The other thing, one of the big 800-pound gorillas in the room is the National Flood Insurance Program and the need to amend that federal statute to better address some of these issues. I mean, I've been involved in representing clients where the absurdity of having the program benefits and then being required to rebuild exactly where you were, as opposed to perhaps using those funds to relocate. What a concept. But right now, that's essentially impossible to do under the National Flood Insurance Program unless you get a special dispensation after such horrible events as Katrina. But I would urge the legislature, I mean, this commission can't change the law, but I would urge the members of the General Assembly to think long and hard about making changes to the existing presumptive prohibition. Now, perhaps in classic legislative fashion, dumping it on you guys is a solution. And on that score, I worry that politics gets involved in it way too much. You know, oh well, this commission might be pro-development, or at this point in time, pro the environment. Well, that's going to change over time. That's going to be as dynamic as the darn shoreline itself. But I do think there is an interesting legal issue there about whether the primary responsibility should be with an executive agency such as the commission versus the legislature itself. And there's no easy answers there, but I would just urge that the General Assembly proceed with caution. And there's some language in both of those bills that's not bad, but I do worry that political movements of the moment can sometimes overwash the longer term need for rational thinking. And this science panel, they acted voluntarily, and it's important to remember they're trying to provide the science. They're not trying to provide the policy solutions. That's going to be up to the commission and the legislature. But this is good information and should be looked at in terms of what's happened off the shore of New Jersey, for instance, compared to us. Thank you.
Wish to speak during public comment? If not, before we get to Jonathan, we are going to the attendance record to show that Commissioner Hennessy is here. did an awful lot of work in a short period of time. We have 3 members here today. Dr. Moore, thank you. Dr. Corbett. Just hidden behind the podium, I think. Anyway, thank you all for your work and your time. We appreciate it very much. And this time I turn it over to Dr. Moore. Good morning.
All right, well, good morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners, Assistant Secretary Dello, DCM, staff, director, and guests. Thank you for gathering today to hear this presentation of the Science Panel's report on the effects of hard structures on open ocean coastlines. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the members of the CRC Science Panel who, as Chair Cahoon said, have worked tremendously hard on a short timeline to prepare the written report of this presentation. Oh gosh, I need to pause for one moment because I need to plug in my computer. We forgot that part. Oh, it's over there. Ooh, no. Is there not one here? Okay. Okay, I'm gonna let you do it. Just heighten the anticipation a little bit more here. Thank you. Good teamwork. Appreciate that. Okay. So I just want to acknowledge our committee members, Dr. Reed Corbett, who is here today, Dr. Andrea Hawks, Dr. Joseph Long. Both Andrea and Joe are at UNC Wilmington. Reed is at East Carolina University. Dr. Brad Murray from Duke University, Dr. Martin Posey from UNC Wilmington, Mr. Spencer Rogers, retired from North Carolina Sea Grant, Mr. Rudy Rudolph, Maritime Program Director at Wilpert, and Dr. Greg Williams, who is also at UNC Wilmington. Importantly, we also have a contributing guest author for this report, and that is Dr. Craig Landry, who formerly was at East Carolina University and now is at the University of Georgia, and he is an economist, and he assisted us with the economic considerations section that the CRC asked us to include. So thank you to all who contributed to this report. Also want to thank DCM for their support and contributions, which were essential to bringing the report to completion. All right. If it wants to go into slideshow mode, it looks like it is. So our charge from the panel is here. Essentially, our charge, we think it was at the February meeting where we presented an outline, and the outline is essentially our charge. And so it'll serve as an outline for what we'll present today. So we start with an introduction to shoreline change and barrier island dynamics. We talk a little bit about the North Carolina coastline specifically, and then we touch on the different categories of erosion management approaches. And this is where we talked about some of the alternatives to structures that you asked us to include. For those who are less familiar, because knowing this will be a public report, we included some background on what's currently allowed in North Carolina and already being used. A second section, I don't know how many of you have been able to read through it. I know we didn't give you a lot of advance time, although we did our best. Hopefully you've had a chance to glance through, but section 2 is really the meat of the report. And this is where we talk about the effects of structures that trap sand and structures that harden the shoreline. We talk about the purpose, the physical effects, adverse effects, ecological impacts, and really we frame all of this largely in terms of trade-offs, because there are benefits and there are costs, and really it's all about trade-offs. In a third section, we talk about some case studies and lessons learned from case studies, and then we made two additions. We added a section on policies in other states, a summary of what other states are doing, and then we also added a section at the end with our recommendations based on the best science and engineering that we pulled on to prepare the report. So we'll start with some introduction, and of course the open ocean coastline issues that we're really focused on today, that hard structures are of interest to mitigate, are long-term chronic erosion and storm impacts. And I'll say that storm impacts are probably what tend to come to mind first for those who are thinking about the problems that we need to address along the coast. However, it is long-term chronic erosion that makes homes and infrastructure vulnerable to storm impacts. Most of our coastline has been naturally eroding over the long term to varying degrees, with some locations having very high natural background erosion rates, such as the northern flank of Cape Hatteras, shown here, which eroded at rates greater than 20 feet per year between 1852 and 1946, and for the many centuries preceding that time. When construction is based on a 30-year setback and buildings last longer than 30 years, the shoreline will eventually intersect or come close to intersecting the development line. And once we're past that 30-year time point, homes will begin to fall within the envelope of storm impacts, which for most storms is from the dune seaward. For very large storms, we know that impacts can extend farther landward. And so this is what we're seeing and we'll see more of in the future. So it's not just storm impacts, of course, as you all know. We talk a lot about shoreline erosion rates here, right? But just highlighting that there's both long-term chronic erosion and storm impacts that mitigation is sought for. So I'd like to start by reviewing what determines how the shoreline is changing over time. And you've, as a commission, have seen these slides before. The next 3 slides I shared in the inlet hazard area presentation, but just by way of review, as you all know, wave processes drive sand along shore. And the direction and the amount of sand moved depends on shoreline orientation and the shape of the offshore seabed. This sets up differences in the amount of sand, the net amount of sand that moves in and out of any location along the shoreline. And it's this balance between how much sand moves in and how much sand moves out that determines whether a shoreline is accreting, growing seaward, like it does in a few areas, especially associated with inlets, or where the shoreline is eroding or moving landward, which is what we tend to see in most areas where we're not sufficiently adding enough sand to counter natural background erosion rates. So I like to use this very simple diagram to illustrate this. So if we think of a section of coast as the blue box, where we have more sand, so a bigger arrow indicating more sand moving into the box and less sand moving out of the box because of the way wave processes and shoreline orientation and the offshore seabed add up to the amount of sand that moves in versus moves out, we're gonna see the shoreline move seaward. And where there is more sand moving out of the box than into the box, this is where the shoreline will naturally erode. And when I teach this in class, I tell my students, this is just like your checkbook. If you are adding more money in than you are spending, then you have a positive balance and you're in the black, you're in the green. And if you are taking out more money than you are actually adding to your checking account, you're gonna be in the red. And in this case of the shoreline, we're gonna be eroding. So it all comes down to this very simple equation. How much is coming in versus how much is going out? And that varies along shore. Now, this equation applies both in the alongshore and in the cross-shore. And you have to add the balance of sand coming in and going out alongshore and the balance of sand going in the cross-shore direction to get the full picture. So just by illustration, here is an aerial image of Ocracoke Island. We're looking at a time period from 1974 to 1988. And here, just looking in the alongshore, at the alongshore balance, the arrows are bigger where there's more sand moving alongshore, and they're smaller where there's less sand moving alongshore. So if we focus on the box, I don't think you can see my cursor, but if you focus on the box on the upper right, there's more sand leaving, so that stretch of coastline is eroding. When we get down a little bit farther to the left, we can see that there's more sand coming in than going out. And so that's an area of accretion. But the balance can change over time. And if we look at the same area from 2009 to 2020, the entire stretch is experiencing a negative balance in a net alongshore sediment transport, and the entire coastline was eroding over this time period. So the alongshore balance is determined by the net alongshore sediment transport and how that varies alongshore. But we also have to think about cross-shore processes, and this is where storms come in. So when we have a storm and the total water level during the storm remains below the dune and the back beach, then the storm impacts are pretty much contained between the dune or the berm and the nearshore offshore. So sand moves offshore, we see erosion, but then it tends to come back during fair weather. Most storms fall into this category, and they don't really add to long-term chronic erosion. We're just seeing sand removed offshore and then brought back onshore. This is a natural process that we expect to occur. It's well documented and well understood. But when we have bigger storms that raise the water level more, so when storm surge is higher or storms occur during high tide or on higher sea level, we can see the potential for the water level to exceed the dune and the back beach. And when total water level rises above the back beach and the dune, we can get erosion of the dune and transport of sand from the beach and near shore onto the island interior. And this represents a loss of sand, so a withdrawal from the checking account of sand to supply the beach and the near shore. And this type of erosion adds to long-term chronic shoreline change, long-term chronic erosion. But on the other hand, natural barrier islands, so if we think just for a minute without homes, how would our coastline behave? Most of our coastline is comprised of barrier islands or barrier spits, as you know, and the overwash process is important in maintaining island elevation above sea level. So as sea level continues to rise, if the elevation of the island isn't getting higher at the same rate that sea level is going up, then it actually gets lower relative to sea level and is more vulnerable to inundation and flooding and storm impacts in the future. So on natural barrier islands, overwash is a process that maintains elevation and keeps the landscape above sea level. However, where there's development, overwash, of course, poses quite a challenge. And on developed barrier islands, a lot of the measures that we understandably take to reduce storm impacts actually reduce or prevent overwash, and therefore prevent sand from making it from the beach and nearshore during big storms onto the island interior. And for this reason, the island interior doesn't increase in elevation and islands become more vulnerable to inundation as sea level rises. So there are some complexities here that are important to keep in mind because of the fact that we're on a coastline that is largely dominated by barrier island processes. So in summary, whether the shoreline is accreting or eroding is determined by the balance in alongshore sand transport, so net alongshore transport. We all know from swimming at the beach that the direction of that alongshore current can change from day to day, right? So you send your kids out to the water and you're like, wait, where are you going? And you know, they've traveled alongshore to the north one day and to the south another day, and they're far from their towel. They don't even notice that they're acting like a particle of sand in the water. But there is a net direction, and it's the net direction of alongshore sand transport that goes into that equation that's like our checkbooks. And then additive to the effects of net alongshore sand transport is the balance in cross-shore transport. With large storms that drive sand onto island interiors or even onto roads and then we scoop it up and take it away somewhere, is a loss to the system and also adds to chronic long-term erosion. So with rising sea level, and we know that sea level is expected to be a foot higher in 2050 relative to the year 2000, along the North Carolina coast, and with projected increases in the frequency of major hurricanes in the Atlantic basin, this balance will tend to become more and more negative over time, which means mitigating erosion and protecting or trying to reduce risk to infrastructure will unfortunately become more and more challenging. This is difficult news to say. I think a lot of us know it. It's a tough reality, especially in the face of seeing so many homes and lives changed because of the loss of shoreline. So I want to highlight at the end of that introduction and background that this report, oh, sure, question. The alongshore processes and cross-shore processes are very similar along open ocean sandy coastlines. I mean, there are some complexities because of rocky coastlines in Maine, for example, so there's not as much sand moving around in the system. Shorelines have different orientations, but yes, these are general coastal processes, and the equation for erosion is the same. What comes in versus what goes out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, structures also play a role in changing that balance. I didn't touch on that, but anything that affects the longshore balance is relevant. So just to highlight that our focus in this report is on erosion mitigation, intention to mitigate erosion and reduce risk on open ocean coastlines only. And so there's tremendous interest in living shorelines, which are a wonderful tool for low wave energy shorelines like our estuarine shoreline, but unfortunately they don't work in high energy open ocean coastline environments. This particular one I believe is oyster shell, and so oysters grow in estuarine environments. This is not a viable approach for the open ocean, so we don't address it in the report. Also, jetties, although they are kind of the quintessential example of sand trapping, they have a different purpose than the structures that we talk about in the report, because their purpose is to stabilize navigation channels and inlets. And so they certainly affect shoreline change, but they have a different purpose, and so we don't cover them in this report. Of course, sometimes groins are locally called jetties, and so that can be confusing, but jetties are longer structures that extend farther offshore, and they are intended to control and stabilize inlet channels and inlets themselves. And just by way of example, I've put up the Ocean City, Maryland example here of the jetty. There's a north jetty and a south jetty. And for those who aren't familiar, alongshore sediment transport, the net direction of alongshore sediment transport is from north to south. And we could even see that. I mean, in my classes, I'll say to students, I won't put the arrow up there. I'll say, well, what's the direction of net alongshore sediment transport? And if they've done their studying and they understand, they'll say it's to the south, because the shoreline extends farther seaward on the north side, which means the sand is being trapped and caught by the north jetty, which means because sand does bypass to some extent around inlets through set of processes we could talk about, but I won't get into, the downdrift barrier island, Assateague Island, which is a national seashore, has moved and retreated landward very far since emplacement of these jetties, and essentially has been turned into a migrating, overwashing barrier because there is so little sand that's making it past that north jetty, and that dashed line indicates approximately where the pre-jetty Assateague shoreline would have been. Very important to stabilize inlets for safe navigation, but this is a trade-off that we have an erosional, highly erosional shoreline to the south, and this is analogous to what we see with groins, although on a smaller scale for groins. All right. So now moving into section 2, and here we have sorted structures into 2 categories. And I'll say that although there have been updates to the way structures are built or designed over time, and there are always new attempts to address long-term chronic erosion and reduce risk of storm impacts, all structures operate in one of 2 ways. Either they trap sand with the intention of mitigating erosion, which also can provide some storm protection. If you have a wider beach and a taller dune, that helps protect from storms. But the primary goal of sand trapping is to mitigate erosion. Or structures harden the shoreline by fixing the backshore in place to reduce risk to infrastructure. So all structures are placed in these two buckets according to how they function, and that is the context for our report. So starting with structures that trap sand, and again, the intention of these structures is to mitigate erosion, counter natural background long-term chronic erosion with the trapping capacity of these structures. And so in the top, I'm showing an image where there are multiple groins. I've highlighted with arrows 4 of them, but you can look at little bumps in the shoreline to the right and see that there are multiple groins along this shoreline. And on the lower right, this is an image from Presque Isle. These are offshore breakwaters. You can see the bump in the shoreline that is occurring from the greatest trapping. And if you look at these images, you can also tell the direction of net alongshore sediment transport, because that bump behind the breakwater is going to be a little bit more updrift than the indentation a little bit farther south, or farther to the east in this case. Now, on the lower left, I'm showing another structure, which is a terminal groin. And these are more complicated. The net direction of a longshore transport is actually from right to left in this image. But because of the inlet, very little sand actually makes it across. And there's a channel right there that is causing the erosion that you see in this image. I know this has since been nourished, and so it looks a lot different and better. But just for illustration purposes, and what's happening here is that we're getting a piling up of sand on the left side of the groin, as shown in this picture, because sand is being trapped during the times when transport is from the west to the east. And so terminal groins are a little more complicated. They tend to be, they're placed at the end of an island. They can be on the downdrift or the updrift side, but many of ours tend to be on the downdrift side, and you'll see this effect of a little bit of a capturing of sand during those times when the current is carrying sand the opposite direction. So groins and breakwaters function by trapping sand that's moving in the alongshore direction. Groins essentially interrupt that alongshore flow by sticking out offshore, their shore perpendicular feature. Breakwaters reduce wave energy and cause sand that's moving alongshore to fall out of the water column and become deposited. So they make it a little bit less high wave energy behind the structure. But essentially that's collecting sand in the same way that a similar way to a groin. So what are the benefits? So the benefits are that these structures can slow the rate of erosion and widen the beach in the updrift direction. The adverse physical effects are that because we are changing the balance of sand moving into the box just downdrift, they tend to increase erosion rates downdrift of the structures. And some of our case studies will illustrate that. Trade-offs are that the updrift areas benefit to the detriment of downdrift areas. These structures require ongoing repair, and the adverse physical effects can potentially be partially offset by repeated nourishment, although that's a lot of sand that would be required to address increased erosion rates downdrift. And very often these structures are used with nourishment on the updrift side to try to increase the sand trapping capacity and to maintain a wider beach. So these are some of the trade-offs associated with these structures. So if we turn to shoreline hardening, here the intention is a little different. The intention is not to slow migration rates. These structures do not affect migration rates. The intention is to reduce the risk to infrastructure from storms. And seawalls can take various forms. In the upper right, I'm showing a concrete seawall. The Galveston seawall, which is one of our case studies, is probably the most famous seawall. It's a recurved concrete seawall. It's believe it's 6 miles in length, so it's a very sizable structure. But seawalls can also be made out of stone, in which case we tend to call them a stone revetment, shown on the lower left. Even sandbags are essentially seawalls because they hold the line and prevent that transport of sand from the offshore to the island interior, and they also prevent adjustment of the beach profile, which, as I'll say in a moment, is really the primary impact of shoreline hardening. I will say that there are also examples of a concrete seawall with rock at the bottom, at the base. There are many, many different designs for seawalls. They all have the same function. So they do tend to reduce the likelihood of direct wave impact to infrastructure during storms, and they can also, for the same reason, reduce flooding and deposition of sand. So they do prevent washover, which again supports the barrier island landscape and makes it habitable for longer, but also is a problem when overwashed lands on our roads and in our backyards. It's a challenge. The primary adverse physical effect, and there are several others, is the loss of the beach. So because shoreline hardening does not change the erosion rate, when you place a structure and you fix the back shore, and you say this is where the back shore is, and the shoreline is continuing to erode, even if you try to counter it with nourishment, there's still some rate of erosion. Eventually, you lose the beach. And that's because if you look on the left, and this isn't a perfect diagram, but it illustrates well enough, we might want to draw our own and add it to the report if that's something that we can do. But essentially on the top, without a seawall, we're looking at, there's a beach, and there's a width to the beach, and there's a beach profile. And as sea level rises or a chronic long-term erosion continues, the beach will tend to move landward. Left unimpeded, if there's sufficient room, the dune and the beach profile shifts landward as a whole, altogether. You can actually see that somewhat in this image. If you look in between the riggings and the stone revetment, you can see that there is a beach, and there's maybe the start of a little bit of a dune behind it, and this is the beach profile in this small section between, working to move landward and reestablish itself as the shoreline erodes. So an example of the type of translation that would occur along this coast if the two structures weren't there. Again, not judging whether that's good or bad, just saying that is what is occurring here. So this is the riggings. Perry Beach? Yeah, thank you. Fort Fisher, yeah. And so another diagram here showing with the seawall. So now we've fixed the position of the back shore. When the shoreline erodes, the beach gets narrower and narrower until it intersects the wall. And then there's essentially, at some point in the future, there's no beach. And you end up with the profile, the offshore profile, intersecting the seawall. Now this means there's not a beach, and so a lot of times we're living in these areas because we want to be at the beach, and now you don't have a beach. But it also means that the profile will get deeper and deeper near the seawall, and this can lead to undermining and damage of the seawall over time. And so that's something that itself needs to be mitigated or the structure repaired at some point. So this arrow on the bottom right is showing the loss of the beach, and that's essentially now a structure that you would stand at the top of and you would look out to see water. And this has occurred on Ocracoke, the northeast end of Ocracoke, if anybody's been there recently, where the ferry terminal is. There are some structures there that now the water's 15 feet deep right off the structure because of erosion. They're associated with an inlet, so it's especially rapid. But there are other adverse physical effects of shoreline hardening. This is a longer list than the list associated with the structures that trap sand. You also have to take up some of the beach when you put the structure in, so you lose some of the beach and dune profile depending on where the structure is placed. I already mentioned the loss of overwash sand deposition. So a wall will really prevent overwash transport except under very extreme circumstances. And so this leads to a lowering of the island landscape over time and vulnerability to soundside inundation and flooding. Seawalls also reduce sand supply for adjacent beaches because the area that's armored, we can also say, or hardened, is no longer available as a sand source. They can also lead to potentially enhanced erosion on adjacent beaches because the primary purpose of a seawall is to redirect wave energy or to some degree absorb it. But sometimes that redirection is not only offshore, it can be to the sides. And so there are cases where these structures have increased erosion on either side of a seawall. And then eventually, as the shoreline continues to erode, perhaps at a slower rate because nourishment has been included in the project, the shoreline on either side of the structure will continue to move landward at a faster pace, and this can lead to a groin-like effect. So if you get to the point where the structured or the armored section of the shoreline is actually landward of the shoreline on either side, then essentially the structure starts to trap sand and will begin to have some of the same effects as the groins and breakwaters that I showed previously. So that would be enhancing erosion rates downdrift when that begins to occur. So there are a lot of trade-offs associated with hardening the shoreline. The first is that, the first trade-off is you're reducing risk to infrastructure, but you're losing the beach, perhaps a public beach. Another is that you're reducing risk versus potential impacts on adjacent shorelines. And that can be due to wave energy redirection, lack of sand supply from the hardened area, and also the groin effect. Reducing risk versus more vulnerability in the future for the island landscape due to inundation, ultimately leading to challenges in keeping the island sufficiently above sea level to inhabit it. And another trade-off is that maintaining a beach in front of a revetment, seawall, sandbag seawall, these are all essentially seawalls, will require greater amounts of sand over time. And that's because of the changing context. So as sea level rises and as storms become more frequent, and we're already seeing that nourishments need to occur more and more often, and that the same will be the case in the presence of an area of shoreline hardening, but to an even greater degree. I'm happy to take questions on that section before I get into considerations if anyone would like to.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes.
So on the, was it Fort Fisher, Fort Macon?
The Curie Beach, the riggings?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the report, I remember reading something in there that said that there's been no mediation that's needed for that. Or
Oh, that's actually Fort Fisher. This is
Fort
a
Fisher.
slightly different area. So I'll
Okay.
get to the Fort Fisher case study.
Okay.
But this is, and this is we don't have a case study on this very stretch of coast that was on our title slide that was nicely provided by DCM, but it just nicely illustrates the different types of seawalls. And so we could talk more directly about that case study afterwards or another time if you'd like. But the Fort Fisher case study is in the vicinity, but not in the picture. Yes. Oh.
Included in hardened structures is riprap.
Yes. Riprap is the stone
I
revetment.
understand that, yeah.
Mhm.
But as I hear you explain this, my own personal experience is that some of the things you mentioned with regard to hardened structures don't apply to riprap because the water comes and flows back and forth and the sand is trapped. in a lot of cases.
Well,
There's gotta have different effects on riprap as opposed to a structure,
so
hardened
like
structure.
like I said, some of these structures are designed to absorb wave energy to some degree rather than reflect it back, and that will affect the degree to which the adverse impacts occur. The effect of a hard concrete seawall is going to be to redirect wave energy more severely, but as you can see from the image, there are a stone revetment or riprap still fixes the position of the backshore, and so the loss of beach, the emplacement loss, and even some of the other factors like the groin effect apply, regardless of whether it's stone or concrete or sandbag. Well, so sure, water does go through, but it still fixes the shoreline, fixes the backshore, and in the scientific literature and the engineering literature, riprap is known to have maybe not as extreme as you say, but similar effects, the same effects as a sandbag wall and a concrete wall. The effects are the same. The degree to which the effects occur can be different. I concede that. But if we're going to simplify this and put, we have these two categories, and I think that's important. Yeah.
One thing that really struck me, and I've known it, and I've been told it, but it's in the report, it's in the photographs, is that the large sandbag structures that we have along the coast are seawalls.
Yeah.
And the beach is disappearing or has disappeared. So that's that's an example of what happens with a seawall.
You're exactly right. And I think because they're considered temporary and they can be made to varying heights and slopes, and the bags may not last forever, they're forgotten as a form of seawall. And we felt it was really important to highlight that they function in a very similar way. They are essentially seawalls. So thank you for picking up on that. Okay? All right. All right. So we also included in the report a summary of ecological considerations, recreational considerations, and economic considerations. Each of these categories, I would say, could be covered in even more detail, but in the context of an overview report, we wanted to highlight that the beaches of North Carolina are commercially and recreationally important for species that are depending on the beach, and they depend on the beach for habitat for the juvenile stage. There are migration routes that are alongshore, and the beaches provide important foraging locations, so much of the food for important species is found in the nearshore and on the beach, and also for nesting. So if we think specifically about the loss of beach on recreationally and commercially important species, sea turtles rely on the beach for nesting and congregation. As we all know, shorebirds rely on the beach for foraging and nesting, and many fish species also rely on the beach and the nearshore or the nearshore area. So losing the beach changes the position of the profile, and also can change the shape of the profile. Groins and barriers also impact migration, because you're now putting a structure out in the water, either perpendicular to the shoreline or alongshore, that can interrupt the migration of commercially important fish species. Recreational consideration is related to some of the ecological impacts that we just listed, or considerations. Fishing piers, shore fishing, the loss of beaches would reduce the economic benefits that beaches bring. and so loss of beach and changes in the nearshore can affect the degree to which fishing piers and shore fishing are undertaken on our shoreline. North Carolina is among the top 5 states in the U.S. for visits and recreation, and obviously the coast is a big part of that. And the reputation of beaches, how beautiful they are, how wide they are, what they look like, contributes to the number of visits that occur each year. And so the loss of public beaches and aesthetic changes that may be deemed undesirable by tourists could reduce visits, and there is an economic study I'll get to in a minute that shows that effect. There's also public safety to just consider and keep in mind and mitigate to the degree possible if structures were to be in place. Structures represent a hazard to boaters, swimmers, kayakers, surfers, and there are many cases where those who are enjoying the beach, whether a local resident or a tourist, have run into difficulties and been injured or lost their life because of the effects of structures in the near shore and on the beach. So you asked us to speak to economic considerations, and none of us on the panel are economists, although some of us work really closely with economists, as I study coupled human natural dynamics, as does Brad Murray, and so we have close ties to the economic literature. But I did ask for assistance with this from Craig Landry, a colleague I've known for years, who's a respected economist who works a lot in coastal environments, and to conduct an economic analysis to determine whether it makes economic sense to install a structure. And I would say it's not always all about economics, but certainly economics are a big part of the picture. Requires accounting for the present value of net benefits over time, which I've abbreviated here. I don't think the economists are going to love my abbreviation, but for the sake of not repeating this many words multiple times, I don't know we're joking about how we pronounce that, but so this is essentially the benefits minus the costs adjusted for inflation, interest rates, integrated over time. And we could talk a little bit more about that if you'd like, but I might refer you to our colleagues who are economists. So essentially, you want to account for that, for the present value of net benefits over time for the project under consideration. And then you would need to compare that to the net benefits, present value of net benefits over time for a counterfactual scenario. And this is economics jargon, but that essentially means current conditions. If you keep doing the same thing that you're doing, what's the present day value of net benefits for that? And then to really optimize from an economic standpoint means not only do you consider the present value of net benefits over time for the proposed project and for current conditions, you also consider the present day value of net benefits over time for feasible alternatives. So this could be other hard structures, beach nourishment, managed retreat, or relocation and removal. And then you essentially find the path of those present day values for net benefits that maximizes the present day value of net benefits. And so this is something that would need to be done on a project by project basis to look at, what is the sort of economic value. And I will say present day value of net benefits over time can be negative as well as positive. And it's also, there's a lot that goes into this because there are a lot of benefits and costs, and some of them are difficult to quantify and put a dollar value on. But we list some of them in the report. Here, I'm just focusing on those associated with structural approaches. So some of the benefits, if the beach is wider, there's data in the literature to show that that does increase home value. It's not surprising. It also increases the use of the beach by those who wish to fish from the beach and from piers, and it also increases the number of visits to the beach. And of course, reducing risk to infrastructure means we're losing less infrastructure. Storm impacts are reduced. Some of the costs are that a narrower beach and a change in aesthetic, downdrift for sand trapping structures, and also in the project area itself, for structures that harden the shoreline leads to decreases in home value. So we might be increasing home value in one place, but then decreasing home values in another place. The eventual loss of the public beach associated with shoreline hardening or downdrift of structures also leads to decreased home value. So not even a narrow beach, but no beach. Loss of fishing use. If there's no beach at all, you can't fish there. And a decreased number of visits. Potential for loss of ecosystem services, such as the ones I listed on the previous slide. And also something to consider is lawsuit exposure. There are many cases of lawsuits that have been brought due to adverse impacts, personal injury, and the cost of ongoing maintenance and mitigation, because once a project is installed, it's not one and done. It's continually needing maintenance and repair and often nourishment, again, at increasing intervals over time to offset adverse impacts. And then I did just want to highlight that management strategy has been shown to affect the number of trips to the beach. So when we talk about the value of erosion mitigation to and shoreline hardening to tourism, we need to keep this in mind, that the number of visits is fewest to beaches with structures. It's been shown to be that more visits are taken to nourished beaches, and that even more visits are taken to beaches where the strategy is a relocation and removal. And to me, that makes sense, because I think, as we're seeing, unfortunately, due to the loss of many homes in Buxton, which is really wrenching to watch, and for those who are experiencing it directly, which I don't have any personal experience of, but I can sense the pain of that. Once homes that are threatened have been removed, the beach profile restores, and the dune starts to come back, and the shoreline starts to recover, and that puts you in the category of a different aesthetic, which explains some of the results there. Again, not advocating for any of this, but just telling you what the research shows about the degree to which, or the number of visits that households tend to take to beaches according to management strategy that's being applied. And in the report, we include a table that you cannot read here, but this is what it looks like. And here, the first two columns are what I showed on this slide for structures that mitigate erosion, or intended to mitigate erosion, and structures that are intended to reduce risk. And then we also, keeping in mind your request that we consider alternatives, included a list of some of the costs and benefits associated with the other management actions that we highlighted in the introduction, just to provide a more complete picture. And again, this is not necessarily exhaustive, but it's what we could compile in the time that we had. So that's section 2. Yes, a question?
Kind of a comment. Looking through that, that's like a PhD wish list of dissertations.
Is it on? You might need to just
I got it
speak closer.
So, if we held every beach nourishment project to that standards, we would never put another grain of sand back on our beaches.
Well, you asked for what an economic analysis would entail, and essentially, if you really want to get at the economic feasibility, or what the true economic picture of a project would look like, this is what you would need to do. I'm not saying you have to do it. We're not saying you have to do it for every project, but it is the standard way that it would be done. And there are economists who do this, and so it's not an infeasible approach. It sounds like a lot to those who aren't economists, I agree, and it is a lot, but if we're going to say the economics are, if one were to want to drive decisions based on economics, this is the kind of analysis that you would need to do.
Just saying, it would be setting a bar for hard structures that no nourishment project is set to meet.
Well,
And if
hard
you look,
structures are a little different than nourishment.
they are, but there is also up drift and down drift as you.
Right, so you have to consider
In-
extended
with
shoreline
nourishment
area.
projects.
True, it's more complicated, I agree. Point well taken.
Questions?
Are we going to look at some of your case studies?
Yes, that's next. Okay. May I grab my? So case studies. These are described in detail in the report, so I'm just not going to spend a lot of time. I'll just move through these so that we'll have time for questions at the end. I realize this is a lot. All right, so we looked at 4 case studies in North Carolina, and then we looked at 3 case studies elsewhere, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas. So our first case study is a shoreline hardening case study here, looking at the revetments at Fort Fisher. Here, erosion was removing this Civil War fort, and the first revetments were placed post-World War II. The revetments were collapsing and were replaced in 1995, and they were successful in protecting the historic structure. So from the perspective of the intention, the infrastructure behind the revetment was protected. There is currently not a beach in front of the revetment for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, and yet repeated nourishment nearby to the north has mitigated erosion on adjacent shorelines to some degree, because the nourishments to the north have allowed there to be more sand in the system, which has been transported along shore, leading to a little bit of a beach to the north of the revetment, and then some of it is passing around, and so some degree of mitigation from nearby nourishment, but no beach in front of the structure itself. Another case study, I know Brian is here, and this is the one that we're all so familiar with from the news and those that we know in this area. Buxton is unfortunately in a location where the background erosion rates are naturally very high. So this is an area of very high, long-term, chronic shoreline retreat. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can see the 1852 shoreline and the 1946 shoreline here from the Division of Coastal Management, and the general location of the 3 groins, locally called jetties. And prior to the installation of the groins, erosion here was more than 20 feet per year. And this has to do with the reorientation of the capes and the shoreline shape here. But suffice to say that this rate of erosion was occurring for centuries, likely centuries, maybe even longer, prior to the time period of when the groins were installed in 1969. There have been nourishments since then, and the groins and the nourishment have reduced erosion rates in this area. You can see that the groins actually created an offset, and so when you look at the bend in the coastline there, the groins are just to the north of that. This offset has persisted, but not necessarily gotten more and more pronounced, and that's likely because the nourishments to the north and the fact that the groins are leaky because they've deteriorated has allowed enough sand to pass through that the shoreline to the north and the south seem to be currently moving landward at about the same rate. And so the nourishment and the leaky groin have mitigated the downstream effects, at least in a continuing fashion, for some time. But it'll be interesting to see when the groins are refurbished, how that affects the downdrift erosion rates. The anticipation is that they would increase. We can look at the terminal groin at Fort Macon. From 1842 to 1888, there was actually a series of groins that were emplaced along the shoreline here. And on the bottom, there's a photo from 1917, which is taken after the terminal groin was installed, because the groins themselves weren't sufficiently addressing the issues here. And so this is a picture of that. Dredge material from the inlet is placed on the beach or passes through and around and over the terminal groin to some degree, and so there is an offset here, but it's not as pronounced as it would be if there weren't the placement of dredged material or if sand weren't making it around the terminal groin. We'll say that the effectiveness of the shoreline stabilization and the erosion mitigation here is that the inlet channel is fixed in place due to federal navigation actions, that sand supply to this stretch of coast, this blue box, is maintained through the placement of dredged material, and that the groin is permeable, which allows sand, some of the sand, to pass through, which assists with the maintenance of a beach on the other side, which is important to the protection of the fort. If any of these three elements were to be degraded or no longer be maintained, then the shoreline would be less stable here. And here, sand trapping case study. We're looking at the groins and the terminal groin at Bald Head. There's chronic erosion of South Beach documented here since the 1970s. And the highest erosion rates were at the western end adjacent to the Wilmington Harbor navigation channel, which is highlighted there in the center of the image, which is from 2025 for reference. And in this area, geotextile tubes were installed in 1995. They decreased the rate of erosion but did not stop erosion. And then the terminal groin was constructed in 2015 with the intention of further decreasing and mitigating erosion rates. There continue to be placements of sand on South Beach to assist in erosion mitigation. So again, it's a situation where we have multiple structures that are in place, and I understand that there's a permit request in or plan to replace the geotextile sand tubes with rock, and so this is an evolving situation, but an example of groins in a terminal groin and sand trapping. You can see in the upper left image some of the effects on the inside of the inlet from these structures. Turning to our out-of-state cases, there are just 3 of these, so relatively quick. This is Presque Isle in Pennsylvania. So this is a Great Lakes shoreline, which is very different than our shoreline. The wave energy is not comparable, but there still is an alongshore transport system. This is on a spit, and here breakwaters, which are pretty small on this picture, but I think you can see the little dashed, it's like a little dashed line on the top image on the left. Breakwaters were installed in 1986 to mitigate erosion in this area, and a significant amount of downdrift erosion resulted. Again, if you're going to trap sand in one place, it's not going to get to another place, and that means that the shoreline and the downdrift area will erode if not mitigated sufficiently. So here, there was 1,000 feet of erosion between 1986 and 2025, downdrift of these structures, so that's about 25 feet per year. There are now trees and shrubs on the beach in this area because the shoreline has passed into the island or the spit interior. And you can see almost that on the left side, kind of right underneath the 2.0 in 2006, it's getting very narrow there. And so that's a place where breaching might occur in the coming decade or two if this erosion continues, which would be the expectation because it has since those breakwaters were installed. And the intent here was to stabilize the shoreline because there's a harbor that's associated with this spit that's very important to this area.
In this picture here,
Mhm.
there's no offshore barriers where you're showing the erosion.
Correct.
There's none there.
Correct.
So it looks like it captured the sand, but they didn't put the offshore reefs.
Yeah, I mean, that would be doubling the project. And I think the decision was that this is an undeveloped stretch of coast, and so let it be as it may, because it must have been, I mean, my understanding is that it was prohibitively expensive to continue the breakwater field all the way along that stretch.
But the sand, you were saying it's robbing the sand. The breakwaters were robbing the sand down drift, but it.
Well, so the breakwaters, if you can see in the top, the beach is much wider and more lakeward on the left side where the breakwaters are. And then there isn't really a beach, and the shoreline is more down toward the bottom of the photo on the right. And that is where we're seeing increased erosion rates, because the sand moving along shore is trapped behind the breakwaters instead of feeding the shoreline downdrift. Can you ask your question again? I'm not sure if that answered it or not.
I'm just wondering if they put the breakwaters, was that actually robbing the sand? Or if they'd put the breakwaters in all the way down, would have that beach been held like it was on the left side of the photo?
Yes, and what would have happened then is that we would have seen erosion of the spit. Because it's going, and even more erosion of the spit, because sand would have been trapped over an even longer stretch of coast. So there would be even less sand reaching the far right end of the spit, and that's what's especially important to the harbor. But yes, I mean, if they continued the project farther, it would have had a different effect. But it illustrates the downdrift effect of sand trapping quite starkly. Yes.
So, this is a freshwater spit, so there's no tidals.
Correct.
There is the sediment's different, right?
It's sandy.
Sand. Okay, so the
So
grains.
sediment's not that different.
Okay. What made you use that as an example?
Well, there aren't a lot of examples of breakwaters on the open ocean coastline on the Atlantic seaboard, because they're generally not deemed to be a great solution to address erosion. So we were trying to be complete, and this is sort of a quintessential example of the impacts of using breakwaters on coastlines. I will say, yes, it's a Great Lake coastline and it doesn't have tides, but the processes that really matter to the physical effects of structures are the wave processes, and Lake Erie has pretty good waves. So it's not a directly analogous system, but it's pretty similar. In fact, I used to live near Cleveland, Ohio, and I did quite a bit of work on Lake Erie, and Sheldon Marsh is a barrier island, and it was news to me that there were barrier islands on the Great Lakes when I was early in my career, but they're fairly similar in their function. You can even see peat banks, cropping out on the shore face, the lake shore face. So
You're not aware of any examples on the eastern seaboard?
Oh
of
gosh, do we?
Submerged structures?
I'm turning to my colleagues. I mean, to our understanding, there weren't case studies that. This was the best case study that we felt we could provide. I'd be happy to take another look, but we did think hard about what to include, and the processes are very similar. All that's missing is tides, and that's not really critical for this effect. Are there other questions? Okay, two more. Sand trapping and shoreline hardening in New Jersey. So New Jersey is famous for using lots of hard structures over a very long period of time. They have a lot of development on their barrier island coastline, and they have for a very long time. So we chose this stretch here from Manasquan to Sandy Hook. You can't quite see the hook, but if you go a little bit farther north of Seabright, this is a 21-mile stretch of coastline from Manasquan to the Sandy Hook spit, where they have been experiencing erosion over long time periods. So to mitigate that erosion and reduce risk, so they're trying to do both, they've installed seawalls and groins since 1915. There have been seawalls and groins in this area. There have been repeated studies to try to figure out how to mitigate the adverse effects of installing seawalls and groins. There's been a widespread loss of beaches along this stretch. And a study in 1989 suggested that nourishment would last longer if some of the long groins were removed. So what happened along this stretch is that there were groins of varying length and varying spacing. And so there was a study done that said, well, if you take out some of the long groins, then that will perhaps reduce some of the adverse impacts that are being felt downdrift from these groins, and maybe even out the rate of shoreline change in between the groins. But that was deemed to be too expensive to modify. Modifying groins is very expensive once they've gone in. So instead what they did in 1994 to 1999 is they notched the groins. And so they went in and they lowered the groins in very specific locations to allow some sand to bypass the groin. So it's basically making the groin a leaky or permeable groin. And that evened out the erosion rates to some degree. They also have an ongoing nourishment program in this area, and we added up the volumes there, and for this 21-mile stretch, it was about $1 billion in current dollars put into this stretch of coast to add sand so that the beach would be maintained and there would be some beach in front of the seawalls. And the last case is the very famous seawall at Galveston. So this has a complicated history, but of course the storm of 1900, still the most deadly natural disaster in the U.S., I believe. 6,000 lives lost, really decimated Galveston Island. Here they did a really interesting thing, which many of you may know. They raised the island. So they buried the first floor of all the remaining buildings in sand, and then they put a very long seawall in front of them. It was constructed in 1904 and lengthened to 6 miles long in 1963, and it has reduced risk in concert with the raising of the elevation, which I will just point out was a big part of that, right? We talk about the importance of overwash. Well, here they added, 10 feet of sand everywhere. That's how many years of overwash that contribution that they gained instantly. But a lot of the length of the shoreline does not have a beach because of the fixing of the back shore. Erosion also undermined the seawall in 1934, and they needed to further armor it, so they added stone at the base. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes seawalls have stone at the base, so they added that. And then to further protect the seawall, they had to add a groin field, and nourishment has been necessary since 1985 to maintain sand in that area. And even with nourishment, there are many long stretches where there just is not a beach, especially at high tide. But the goal of achieving reduction in risk was achieved. It's just there were trade-offs. So each of these case studies are provided with the intention of illustrating the trade-offs. So you mitigate erosion in one location, you're going to likely generate erosion in another location, or at least generate the need for additional mitigation elsewhere. And just there are trade-offs to be considered. So I would say, in summary, some case study insights. There are adverse effects that occur and require ongoing mitigation. And where groins are located next to sand sinks, there may be slightly less of an adverse effect. So that's something to keep in mind. To the point made earlier about the different types of seawalls, perhaps keeping in mind the design and how the adverse effects vary with design is also valuable. Essentially, a really important factor to keep in mind is that when you fix the back shore with a hardened structure, there will be loss of beach, and that's inevitable on an eroding shoreline. And that's unless you can place sand at a sufficient rate to counter erosion. But I would say in places where one might want to put a seawall, nourishment already hasn't done the job. And so fixing the back shore and thinking you're going to build a beach with nourishment is a challenging proposition. Nourishment will continue to become more expensive. There's lots of talk among those who study sand resources that sand sources are becoming more difficult to come by. And I think I made the last point already. So very briefly, the report also includes a summary of what other states are doing, what other state policies are. And overall, we would say that although hard structures have been permitted in many states, their use is generally discouraged in those states because of the adverse effects that we have illuminated in our report. And there are a few states where new structures are just not allowed, and that would be Maine, Rhode Island, and Texas. And other states are tending to go in the direction of discouraging new structures as well. So with all of that in mind, given our scientific and engineering knowledge and understanding, we have included a few recommendations for you to consider. The first is that we recommend maintaining a cautious approach to expanding the use of hard structures. And this is because hard structures may achieve goals locally, but they also alter the coastal system and coastal processes and can lead to adverse effects both within the project area and beyond the project area, including loss of the public beach, which is what is bringing a lot of people to the coast and to North Carolina. We would also recommend that if there were to be a major policy change, that would best be preceded by a broad assessment of various factors that would be impacted along the North Carolina coast by a change in policy, and this would include, considering the positive and adverse effects of structures, the ecological and recreational effects, the economic net benefits over time, and also considering who benefits and who bears the impacts, because that is something that is worth keeping in mind as well. And then, really important, what are the long-term maintenance and mitigation obligations that the state would be signing up for were this policy to change? We have a lot of beautiful coastline. We also recommend that if the policy were to change, that any proposed project undergo a comprehensive evaluation that includes things like the likelihood that the intended outcome would be achieved and the adverse physical effects both within and beyond the project area, and again, the ecological, recreational, and economic considerations, many of which we've illuminated in the report, and that there be a required monitoring, maintenance, and mitigation plan, and that the monitoring plan, if a project were to go forward, is required to be completed and is comprehensive to document adverse impacts and identify mitigation that would be needed. We also recommend that there be clearly defined triggers for modifying or removing structure or mitigating adverse effects. We do recommend not authorizing projects for which adverse effects cannot be mitigated sufficiently to make the trade-offs acceptable. And again, it's all about trade-offs, and it's perhaps challenging to think about who decides whether the trade-offs are acceptable or not. A lot of the costs and the benefits depend on the perspective that one is looking at this challenge from. We want to point out that the long-term function and habitability of the North Carolina Barrier Island system is much more likely if the priority remains on strategies that maintain the alongshore sand transport system and allow barrier island processes to occur, rather than attempting to hold the shoreline in place with hard structures. And a few lessons from other coastlines. In fact, before I do that, I do want to make one point here, which is that it's also worth keeping in mind that much of the Outer Banks coastline is within the national seashore. And hard structures are run directly counter to the mandate of the national seashore. Many of you probably know this, but just to keep in mind. And their mandate is to preserve the primitive character of the ever-changing barrier islands and provide for recreational use and enjoyment that's compatible with preserving natural resources. Now that's the mandate. I'm just telling you what it is. The National Park Service makes up, or the national park boundaries, and the national park itself make up a large portion of our shoreline, and hard structures are counter to their mission. So that's an important point to keep in mind. So a few lessons from other coastlines, and I believe this is my last slide. Other places are moving cautiously. Many states limit hard structures on sandy oceanfront shorelines because of the adverse effects that we have shared. Some states that have historically allowed more shoreline armoring have moved toward stronger limits. And many regions that have a sort of long history of experience using hard structures are actually reassessing their use and to some degree discouraging their use, especially with regard to new hard structures. And interestingly, the Netherlands gets brought up a lot. In parts of Europe, including the Netherlands, hard structures in many places, select places, are being removed or modified or set back from the shoreline so that natural processes can resume. And this is called managed realignment. I actually know of a few cases personally that colleagues of mine are studying in the Netherlands. And this is occurring because after long period or long history of using these structures, they're recognizing that the adverse effects and the prevention of natural processes is something that is not desirable in the long term. And I just wanted you to be aware that this is the direction that some places are moving. So expanding the use of hard structures in North Carolina would run counter to a broader trend among jurisdictions that have a long period, long-term experience in managing the effects of these structures. And with that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. I know that was a long presentation, but we wanted to be thorough in sharing our report with you. So thank you for your attention and your questions throughout, and I'll leave it there.
Appreciate it. There's a lot of reading to do and a lot of information to absorb. And we need to get rereading it as we go forward.
Dr. Moore, thank you for that presentation. I was just curious on your case studies, if you had looked, or the group had looked at any of the impacts of the Wrightsville beach jetties on the Masonboro Island Preserve and what's happening south of there.
We did not get into that case study. I mean, there are several that we could choose from, and we were not exhaustive because we were trying to provide an overview, but certainly there have been some impacts there. It's a place that I'm a little bit familiar with. So it's, we could speak to it a little bit more if that would be helpful, but it's another example of a place where downdrift impacts are occurring. I know that there are efforts to place dredge material on Masonboro that are a bit hit or miss, and something that's being looked at for the future to be done a little bit more comprehensively. But it's another example we could have looked to.
So just a couple points, quite a lot of information. When you had those 3 states up that you said that are banning hardened structures, I think Texas still allows them to be built on private property. Is that right?
Daniel's not here.
It's 200, it has to have a 200-foot buffer, but it still allows some type of structure.
This may be for public lands, which
And then Rhode Island, I think it was only barrier islands, which is, it's a very small coastline, so I think it was about 75% of their coastline, so 25% of their coastline still allowed some type of structure.
well, I think it's that new structures are not allowed. So repair
That was in Maine.
perhaps allowed.
That's in Maine.
Well, Maine for sure. Maine has had a very long-standing
But
policy
correct, but
against structures.
what I read there too, it also allowed certain riprap in Maine under certain circumstances. So what I'm getting to is I don't even think those 3 states have a straight up ban like our state does, that doesn't matter what your case is, you have 30 homes falling in, doesn't matter. It's just straight up not eligible to be considered. Couple points too.
I don't think that in these places it's homes that are are being protected by structures. Just, we could look into that a little bit more deeply, but these are places that do not allow new structures on public land, as I
Sure.
understand it.
I wasn't going to get in the weeds of them. I was just pointing
Well,
that
you
out.
kind of get into the weeds a
Well, I
little
was
bit.
just
That's
pointing
okay.
out that there's 3, and then you got all those other states there out of the 18.
Well, they're regulated, and here they're regulated.
Couple points I just want to.
She wants to trade.
The offshore barrier reefs, I know in your examples, you said you couldn't find any, and I don't think there are on the
Mhm.
Atlantic coast, but there's a Reef Ball Foundation International. They have
Mhm.
national reef ball foundations here, and they're big proponents of offshore artificial man-made reefs.
Yes.
And they have a lot of good examples of where they've had success on the Gold Coast of Australia, the Cayman Islands in front of the Hilton Resort. And I would love to see that included in the report, even though you don't
yes.
have local, but they're oceanfront, subject to hurricanes, typhoons, etc.
So we did look into reef balls as you had recommended. We decided, because there are so many different companies and shapes and types of materials that can be used for breakwaters and submerged breakwaters, we opted not to name any particular company or product within the report because we're providing an overview. I do believe that in looking at that particular example, we found that there were differences between where they had been implemented and our coast, and that a lot of their cases are in lower wave energy locations. So it was our assessment that any submerged, and in addition to that, any submerged breakwater would function in the same way in terms of benefits and adverse effects as a visible breakwater by trapping sand in one area, leading to the an increase in erosion rates in an area downdrift. So the very material might differ, but the function and the adverse effects are the same. And so this is part of why we opted not to go through. I mean, there are just hundreds of different types of materials that can be used, and so we really appreciated you bringing that to our attention, and we thought hard about whether to call out a particular company or not. And
Well, without calling out a particular company, but there are examples of that being successfully used, maybe not on the Atlantic coast, but
well, if you
in
want to
other
forward a particular example that you think is really relevant
We've got
and
about 30 of
to,
'em.
I'd be glad to take a look at it, and we have called the report a draft, so I can talk with the panel.
Yeah, just a couple of observations, and first of all, thank you and the science panel for providing us this valuable report. I think we need to be clear-eyed about what these structures are, and they're to protect infrastructure. And I've actually been pleased with the coverage I've seen in the newspaper about the bills that are under consideration. I think with one or two exceptions, they were focused on protecting infrastructure. I did see one or two that talked about saving the beaches.
Right,
And,
that's
you know,
something that's misunderstood
I know.
sometimes. What are we protecting is a really important
And,
question.
yeah, I think what I heard from you generally is that the beaches will be just fine left alone. That we don't need these structures to protect the beach.
Mhm. That's good.
One thing that I learned out of this was that with structures such as groins, that there are ongoing costs, that the structures need to be maintained. In many cases, you still have to nurse the beach. And after a period of time, the structures need to be replaced. And I think in one of the case studies, they actually had to build additional groins downdrift of the original installation. You could actually find yourself in two different jurisdictions.
Yeah.
So there's that potential conflict. So the report helped bring that home to me, so thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad it was helpful. I think you picked up on some very important points there.
Yes, just wanted to just kind of give a comment and then summarize a couple of points I found in the report that I thought were key to illuminate. In the bald head one, and just reading that a little bit more, and maybe Mr. Emery, since he was, I think, on the commission at that time in 1995, was that a variance that gave them that permission? Do you know? So there was a variance that was granted to start it, and then it was additional terminal groins were added in 2015. Is that correct? Okay.
Right, so although we have this law, there are variances.
Correct, but that was prior to the law that went into place that allowed for that variance to go in effect. If they tried to do that, they would not be able to get a variance.
No, the law went into effect in the 80s, no?
No, it did not.
Oh. I am not here about the law. I'm just here about the science, so. The initial of Greenfield, yes. Was an exception. Right. It was one of the few groins that were allowed.
One of four that was
Yes.
allowed, and then it was
Right.
increased to 6.
Thank you, yes.
But in 2003, the law went into effect to say that no hardened structures were allowed on our coastline except for sandbags. Prior to that, it was a CAMA rule that
Got
was
it.
put in place in 1985, which allowed for them to come and get a variance from the commission.
Right,
So,
thank you.
anyways, in the report, it says the terminal groin at Bald Head Island has helped to mitigate erosion on South Beach by trapping westward moving sand that would enter into the Cape Fear River navigational channel. I mean, that's saying that the structure works. Is that right?
We're not saying that it doesn't, yeah, we're saying that it did do that. It
Okay.
prevented sand from reaching the inlet, which reduces dredging needs a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Other one I wanted to touch on was Fort Macon, which was built, I guess, in 1960, which, was quite some time. And the report describes a stable shoreline system sustained by 3 factors, and you touched on fixed inlet position, sustained sediment supply, and a permeable groin structure that enables continued sand bypassing. So, and then it also says in the report, the effectiveness of this system is dependent on the continued presence of all 3 elements. Removal or degradation of any one component would likely result in a materially different and less stable shoreline position. So if I take that, in other words, if you remove the structure, that would destabilize the shoreline. Correct.
We're saying that this is effective because the maintenance that's required has been ongoing.
So the
Yep.
structure isn't the problem.
We have been careful to include examples that have been successful, but also have costs and trade-offs associated with them, as well as examples that have been less successful. You are correct.
Then the last one is Fort Fisher, which was, I guess, protected. It was a revetment to protect a Civil War historical site. Is that right?
Yes.
In the report, admits that, let's see where it says. The report says due to repeated updrift nourishment, no mitigation has been needed at that one.
Yes, and the report also says there is no beach in front of the revetment. So again, that's a trade-off. Here, the protection of the historic fort was deemed more important than maintaining the public beach in front of the fort for a stretch of coast. So this is a public historic site that's of value to the state and the nation that was deemed more important to protect than the public trust beach in front of it. So we are saying that the protection, the goal was to provide risk reduction to the fort, protection for the fort, and in that way, this project has been successful. It also illustrates the loss of beach when you fix the shoreline position. Oh, yeah.
If we're gonna go into some of these in more detail, one that I'd like to understand a little bit better is the Bald Head Island. Because in reading the report and looking at the photos, I was having trouble really understanding the trade-offs there. I don't know if we have time
Well,
to look at that.
So what I'll say is that this was a group effort, and some of us are more familiar with the particular case studies than others. And I believe that it was Joe Long who put this one together. I don't know how familiar the two of you are with this, but the particular trade-offs here, I mean, ongoing maintenance cost is one trade-off. Do you want to comment, Spencer, briefly?
The terminal groin at Bald Head is on the edge of being a jetty or a groin, in effect that is preventing sand from going into the navigation project in addition to stabilizing the shoreline. And the original geotextile groins were not sufficiently trapping enough sand to prevent shoaling in the navigation channel or to stabilize the shoreline on the other side, on the river side of the shoreline. So the terminal groin was built to be leaky enough to trap more sand on South Beach and still allow enough transport into West Beach to keep it from eroding in farther into the island and prevent sand going into the navigation project. Now, the irony of Bald Head is that for the last 5,000 years, South Beach has been accreting up until around 1900, 1922. And since then, the east-facing beaches that had been eroding at high rates have been relatively stable, and South Beach has been growing slower. So, ironically, it's an accreting beach in the long-term scheme of things. So this is trapping sand that's abundant from the navigation project within the growing field and within the terminal groin. Anything specific that you?
Yes.
So I think a point worth making is that the places where hard structures are present along the North Carolina coast at the moment are places where there has been a decision to protect something of federal interest, like the forts, like the naval facility in Buxton, and navigation. So even at Oregon Inlet, we have a terminal groin. It's really similar to Bald Head it's a short jetty, essentially, because it was emplaced to stabilize the inlet channel. And what we don't have examples of are, groins in the middle of barrier islands to protect private property, which is more analogous to the places that we see in New Jersey. So I would say that with careful intention around and attention to trade-offs and careful placement, we do have some examples of where structures have done their job, but there is the associated adverse effect and trade-off, like the loss of beach.
Also, for Bald Head, the Corps relocated the channel that moved it somewhat closer to Bald Head, and there were trade-offs about how to protect that island more after that channel, because that caused a lot more erosion.
Well, and I can say that, again, we had a short time frame to put this report together. We called it a draft for that reason. So we can take another look at the Bald Head example with your comments and questions in mind and more clearly articulate the trade-offs in that
Spencer?
example.
The interesting thing about terminal structures in particular is by definition they're at the end or near the end of a sand transport system. And to design a successful terminal structure, you gotta get it just right, so that you want some transport through it, but not too much and not too little. And Bald Head seems to be doing that, Fort Macon seems to be doing that. Both of those are tied to beach nourishment on the adjacent beaches. So that's not an easy design criteria, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
And we could say in Ocean Isle, we've seen the challenges associated with maybe not getting it quite arranged the way that one would hope. I will also highlight this second bullet, which is that where groins are located adjacent to sand sinks, adverse effects may be more limited and the trade-offs may be more acceptable. So the terminal groins are examples, or the terminal groins that are acting like jetties in a couple of cases would fall into that bucket because they're catching sand to some degree that would have been lost to an inlet, and so that helps to mitigate.
Just back to the Fort Fisher, and I'm just trying to do this to understand. It says in here, since the sand addition, and this is referring to, I guess, the Carolina Beach nourishment, although a low tide beach remains absent at each end of the revetment, a pocket beach formed. What's the pocket beach that? Oh, okay, so that's what
to
we're.
the north, I don't have a laser pointer, but the area to the north of the revetment is considered a pocket beach. Is perhaps coastal geomorphology lingo, but it's a short beach in between two headlands, and here the revetment is serving as a headland. You hear about pocket beaches a lot on the west coast because they'll have, rocky outcrops that stick out, and then sand can become trapped in between outcrops.
There's no beach in front of it, but there is still beach around it.
Yeah. And as the shoreline continues to erode, the revetment will stick out farther and farther. And, yeah.
Hey, this is the draft that we're accepting. This is not the final document. I'm sure people will still have questions. This will be back on our August agenda. More discussion. We appreciate you bringing it back to us today and answering questions. I'm sure if anybody has any more questions as we go along, please submit them in writing to the division. Our group can consider them as well.
Yes, we'd be glad to do what we can to address questions that come up.
I'm just curious about if we get back up to the Buxton jetties or groins.
Yeah.
What I heard you say was that the degradation of possibly the degradation of the groins has led to less transfer of sand.
More transfer of sand, less adverse effect downdrift.
Less adverse effect. So who is going to be, assuming that the jetty's repaired, do we have anything in place, either any of the scientists or anything that we're doing from a state level to study what happens after the repairs are made?
That's a great question. I hope so, but I don't know what the permit looks like, so I would pass that along to Tancred. Perhaps he knows what has been included in terms of study. So around the end and over the top under high water conditions. Yeah, and the fact that nourishment will occur, at least in the short run, it will help to mitigate downdrift impacts. It's a question of how frequently that can be done, because you're trying to counter very high natural background erosion rates here, and so it's difficult. It's a lot of sand that's required.
Do you have anything, Bobby?
I believe in the permit there are some construction monitoring that we have to do and data that we have to provide, I think, both to the DCM and to the Park Service, post-event. It is a leaky groin is its term that allows sand to go through it and around it on purpose. And the idea is that when the groin was in better shape than it is now, our first beach nourishment project held longer. And the thought is if we replace this groin, that if we can get the beach nourishment projects to last the way they did after the first project, then we can afford to continue to do beach nourishment. At the same time, by having a leaky groin, the idea is it won't accelerate what's already happened to the south of the groin. That's what we think, but until we do it, we don't know.
So the idea is that the offset might remain, but that hopefully
It won't
it will
increase.
increase, yes. And
Correct.
in some ways, we're fairly close to the end of an island here, so this is somewhat analogous to a terminal groin.
Two things. One, there has got to be a better descriptor than leaky groin. There just has to be. And
Permeable groin. Is that
And-
better?
yeah.
Okay, we'll use that.
second of all, I really feel for the people whose homes are imperiled. I lost my home to Florence in 2018. And as was mentioned in public comment, I got tied to the same piece of property.
Yeah.
So I'm still in a perilous place, even though we replaced the home. So I very, very much understand where they're at and the emotions that are tied to your home. But all I can see in this report is where you place it, you're picking who gets protected at the expense of someone else. And how do you determine which citizen has earned a hardened structure and which ones haven't? Because that other people have homes too, and it just seems like,
Yeah.
how do you choose who gets it and who gets the adverse impact?
And that's why we mentioned that considering who benefits and who suffers adverse impacts is important. And I don't envy the one who has to make that choice. And it's also not just nearby homeowners. It's also the public, especially given that we have a lot of national seashore in our state, and millions of people come to North Carolina from all over the world to visit the beaches in our national seashore. So the loss of public beach is another trade-off.
Sort of along that point, I think a good thing that would be, that's unusual. But I think a good thing to put into the report, and this is from the last meeting, Ken Richardson gave us an update on the ocean erodible rates that are updated every so many years. And there was one particular table in there talking about who gets help, who doesn't get help. But one very beneficial table in there was, as Bobby Alton says, the whole coast is falling into the ocean, but yet it's about, I think, less than a mile of 60 miles you've got up there you're trying to maintain. But the data that Ken had, I was amazed as far as oceanfront severe erosion. What was it, 1-3%, something like that? It was a small percentage of these hotspot severe erosion areas versus the rest of the shoreline kind of is being able to be maintained. And
Hanging in for now.
yeah, and but it's an important thing as far as when we move forward, whichever direction this goes, that we have a good context of that, that we aren't talking about the entire coastline of North Carolina. We've got severe hot spots of erosion. Buxton, Rodanthe is definitely the class child there on that. But it would be, I think, good information to have in the report, to have that kind of data so we have this in context of what the problem and what policies may have to go
We
in.
did talk about erosion hotspots and what leads to them, but we didn't point them out specifically. With some assistance from Ken, we could be more specific about the hotspots. I mean, there are several identified in the area from Pea Island southward. It's not just a mile, it's more, but and Rodanthe is particularly challenging because they are within, they're not at the end of an island, and they have a very high erosion rate. These are our hot spots. These are the areas that are forcing consideration of the future, I guess.
Just to follow up to Larry's point, it stood out to me then when you were talking about the offshore reefs in front of the Hilton. So, I mean, I
Yeah.
think experience shows us who gets chosen.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure who to ask this of, but is it feasible to think of the infrastructure of Highway 12 being maintained and overwash being allowed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we have an example of that in Ocracoke, where there is a continuous battle to keep the road open. What's a challenge is that if you're low enough to receive frequent overwash, then you're also low enough to be frequently flooded. And so we have a highway that's closed fairly often, and residents who can't get to the ferry either because of flooding or because of overwash needing to be cleared from the road. But the road stays. I mean, it's better for overwash to be deposited on roads than for a road to be just high enough for the waves to cause damage. So, I mean, but I know DOT is finding that a real challenge, and the people living there are finding it a real challenge. And so you can maintain a road and have overwash on top of it. But do you mean going into the interior to get the elevation gain, or are you talking about the road specifically?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, the road to Key West is
Yeah.
essentially built up. So
right.
is it possible to, over the next 50 years,
Right.
to build Highway 12 in a way that allows overwash
Right.
to allow the island to
I
get
gotcha.
higher?
So I will say, first of all, on Ocracoke, there is overwash making it into the island interior when it occurs. So it's going across the road and getting there. But certainly if you build an elevated road and you allow overwash processes to occur underneath it, there is the potential for overwash to make it to the island interior or the marsh and elevate the landscape. The challenge too is that we are on a barrier island coastline that has been migrating landward for thousands of years, and we've had a slow rate of sea level rise for the last several thousand years, and sea level rise rates are going up. And so, eventually you might have roads that don't have island underneath them anymore, but for a time you could see nourishment and resuming nourishment of the island interior through overwash processes, and some of that is visible, in the vicinity of the Jug Handle Bridge. We're seeing some natural processes return. Certainly in Europe, there are cases where adjusting the structures leads to return of beneficial processes. So yes, there are options in that regard.
So the answer is yes. When the water comes over the road, you can wait for it to recede and you can move the sand. And that's what we do all the time, all year round. That occurs.
Not just on
But throughout, from the Bonner Bridge all the way to Hatteras Village, somewhere, the whole island. And that's all well and good until the road gets undermined. And it's all well and good depending on how long you're talking about having water and sand on the road. If it's a day, then fine. If it's a week, it's problematic. If it's 3 weeks, then it's detrimental to the community. And so what's happening now is DOT and Dare County are working on just that issue, on what can we do in the areas, especially in the areas that aren't developed, in the areas through the refuge and through the park, where the villages aren't, can we do things there to elevate roads, to move roads, to go out in the sound to go around those places, to allow the natural processes to occur in those areas, and at the same time maintain access to the villages. In the villages in Buxton and the places where we're doing that, then that's really not a viable alternative, because you've got all the development that's there, and unless you're willing to lose that development, then you can't allow that to happen. And so you've got different solutions for different places, and we're working on that from both of those angles. So-
Well, and that's a great addition, and what I would say is there's also, I mean, you've kind of referenced the SAND study that DOT is leading, and there's also a modeling study that Bobby and I are working on together to look at in placing, you know, these treating the areas that are undeveloped differently than the areas that are developed, and what does that look like in terms of long-term projections?
And what we have seen anecdotally and on a very small scale is the area where the Etheridge Bridge is, and that's the little short bridge just before you get to Rodin. That was an inlet that you could get a boat through after Isabel, and today that bridge is there. That is closed in. If you look at the beach, there's a small dune growing there. It's a wider beach. The process is working there, and it seems that erosion rate is slower, at least, than it might have been before, after that inlet was cut. So that can work. And then Dr. Moore mentioned that where the Jug Handle Bridge is, that's going to be a case study, because where that road was isn't going to be maintained any longer. And so as those dunes fail and you get overwashed, they're not going to be replaced, and I guess we'll see what happens then.
Thank you, Dr. Moore, and to the science panel for your report.
You're welcome. Thank you. Our pleasure.
And we ask you more questions.
No, please do follow up, and we'll clarify where needed and make adjustments. Thank you.
If I might, I just want to pose a kind of I guess, a philosophical question for ourselves, I guess. I was struck by the amount of times in this study where they used the terms trade-offs. And that trade-off, I guess, like good for bad, bad for good, whatever. But a trade-off is really a situational decision. I think you're alluding to that. It's giving up or reducing a quality, a quantity, or a benefit to gain a different, more desirable benefit, presumably. You all agree with that? Who's making that decision? Are we? Who's making that decision at the end of the day? State, federal government, county, commissions, all of the above? Somebody's got to be held responsible for the decision. Who's being held responsible for that decision? And they're basing that decision on the decision that we might make, or recommendation we might make. Where does the owner come in? What? It's a decision. Well, the public doesn't own them unless it's publicly owned, I guess.
Just going to follow up on that. It's the public trust doctrine that kind of governs the beach, and and I think there was a case with Emerald Isle that went to the state Supreme Court that kind of confirmed some of that stuff. So, I think all of our perspectives would want to be to not do anything that's going to harm the public beach. I mean, we want to keep that at the forefront, that we want access for our public to our beaches. But we also got to have the tools and the flexibility that 15, 18 other states on our eastern seaboard have that we don't. And that's unfortunate because of a straight up statute ban, what can be considered. The statute right now allows sandbags, and I would be a little bit more curious to have a little bit more information on sandbags and how much of our beach is covered with sandbags right now, and what are some impacts that we're seeing with those being on our beaches. Correct. And so, and that's something that's, those rules there are certain triggers that allow people to go and get a sandbag. Not anybody can go out there randomly just start putting sandbags out on their beaches too. So I think it's a clear point that we need to make, that there would be certain triggers and stuff. So.
I just wanted to maybe tee up a couple of things for a future meeting, and they're related to what our discussion today. I'd like to better understand barrier island dynamics and the whole question about how dependent they are on overwash to maintain their elevation. So just better foundational knowledge on that. And I'd also be interested, Bobby mentioned the work that's ongoing with Highway 12. It's one thing to talk about a community with a hotspot, but it's another thing to talk about a whole highway. And if they may take different remedies. So I'd really be interested to know what that conversation is that's going on with DOT, just at some point in the future.
If it's possible also to follow up on the what other states are doing with structures. So when I read the report from the science panel, I had a different view than Mr. Hennessy of what other states were doing, and I realized that the science panel was not not explaining the law. So I don't know if it's something that we can get maybe more from a legal perspective what other states are doing. Add a little more understanding there.
Just one, you're right. There's a lot of restrictions when it comes to wanting to do these, and it's not that you can go out there and accessibly do it, but there isn't a straight up ban that they can't be even considered under a variance. There are rules and triggers that might allow them, and I actually took the summary as pretty much confirming that, so I'd be curious to talk to you. Yeah.
I guess this falls under old and new business, but the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, which you so ingraciously appointed Commissioner Emery and I to be on, they met in May, and this year is there's going to be a new updated Coastal Habitat Protection Plan. I won't go into the specifics, but they will be coming probably in August, I think, because they've got to get this thing through by November. So you should be seeing an update